The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Our near-death experiences tools the collective unconscious of the world uses to send messages to us about how we should be leading our lives. And are we here to define our individuality, define our collectiveness, or both? Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. Just returned from the magic of our 4-day weekend in San Antonio, Texas, where we looked at all aspects of near-death experiences as rites of passage. Our next conference will take place next summer in Orlando, Florida. It's at the end of July, and I'm already looking forward to it. Our guest today is Nancy Rynes, author of the recent book, Awakenings from the Light. Nancy started her education as an artist at Chicago's American Academy of Art, but went on to earn a degree in geology from Northern Illinois University, and then she attended the University of Colorado for master's level geology coursework. The sciences taught her to base her views on things she could measure, and since spiritual matters were not measurable, for her they did not exist. She writes that her skepticism remained until January of 2014, when she experienced a traumatic accident and near-death experience. And since her NDE, she's returned to a more spiritual and creative life based on what she learned. She now writes books and teaches about the divine, what happens when we die, and how we can bring something of heaven to our lives on earth. Nancy, welcome to NDE Radio.
Thank you, Lee. I'm happy to be here.
Perhaps we could begin, Nancy, by your telling the listeners about your accident, your terrible accident, and your later NDE.
Sure. Well, this happened in January of 2014, very early in the month. It was actually the end of my Christmas vacation, and I know for those on the East Coast, it may seem odd that I might actually go out on a bike ride during a Christmas vacation, but here in Colorado, that's often the case. We had a lot of warm weather that early part of January, so that there was a morning that I went out on a bike ride. I was just going to bike around town, and I'll just try to keep it short, but I went through a new section of a road in town where they had just put in a brand new roundabout, and I went around on the biking path. So there's a little bike lane around the roundabout, and there was a woman that was coming in from a side road, and it looked like she had seen me, but at the very last minute I realized that she hadn't seen me, and she struck me broadside, and I ended up through a seemingly long series of almost comic, I'm sure, incidents. I was up on her hood and then looking in through her windshield and then grabbing onto her bumper. But eventually she kept driving, and I ended up being dragged underneath of her car actually it was an SUV. I was dragged underneath the SUV for approximately 50 feet or so. And didn't really know what was going on, but at the time I noticed something really odd, that my consciousness had split apart, and so there was a part of me that was watching the whole accident from out in front, a very calm, observant, very kind of spiritual part of me that was very sad, but at the same time very accepting of what was happening. And then there was I call it the scared little rabbit stuck underneath the SUV, who was in a very kind of mild state of panic, just trying to live. And that state lasted for a few minutes until the paramedics arrived. And so that was my first kind of encounter, I guess you would say, with the other side. It was very brief, but a couple of days later I was brought into surgery. I had some pretty traumatic injuries, the most traumatic being my back was broken in many, many places, and I had shattered one vertebrae in my lower back. And so that needed surgery. And it was during surgery a few days later that I actually truly had what I call the big NDE. and that was a full-blown, I actually, my heart rate on the operating table went to 0, my blood pressure tanked, my breathing tanked. And it seemed to have, in hindsight, it was some kind of odd reaction from the anesthesia, but which I guess happens sometimes. But, instead of going into a state of blackness, I went into a pretty amazing place. I really was surprised at where I ended up, quite frankly. It was a lovely scene with, the beauty of it, the physical beauty of it is beyond compare. It was just this brilliant, almost pearlescent light, but I could also see mountains and big trees and vistas and beautiful clouds, and that the visual aspect was stunning. But what really affected me, and I noticed right away, was that there was a feeling of peace that persisted through everything, and a feeling of utter love and welcoming that still today, even more than 18 months later, still affects me. I can feel it today. It was like a big embrace coming home. It was a welcome home from what I now call the divine. And that lasted, that state of just bliss, of communal bliss with God, I think lasted, in my time there, it seemed like it lasted for days. And then eventually a figure approached me, and she appeared to be female. And again, when she approached me with this huge embrace of pure welcoming love. It was amazing. I can't, there's no way to put words to it, how welcoming and loving all of this was. And she said she was there to help me learn and to help guide me through this place. And that's kind of how it started. So
now, I think you said in your book that you lay down in the field for a while and looked up at the sky.
Yeah, it was really an interesting experience. So she was there to show me around, but I quickly realized, and she quickly told me that I was also there to learn. She wanted to teach me some things that I could take home with me, basically, when I came back to Earth, that would help me live a more spiritually centered life and a happier life. And so she, we walked around. It was kind of like the grand tour, I guess you would say, but she showed me around heaven, or at least this part of heaven that I was in, and taught me many, many things. And during that time, though, you get tired. At least I was still partially human in my mind, and I couldn't take a lot of it. And I also didn't want to come back here. I knew she was preparing me to come back here, and I didn't want to do it. So there was a point, we were on kind of what looked to be like a hill with an open meadow, and she just laid down in the grass at one point and stared up at the sky and started picking out cloud animals in heaven. And of course, at some point I joined her, and we started looking for, rabbits and dragons and all kinds of crazy things up in the sky. And I thought, this is really weird. Who goes to heaven to look for cloud animals in the sky? But that's what we were doing. But I think, in hindsight,
now just
doing it
to
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to jump back for a minute, I think you said in the book that you had the feeling that as you were walking along, the scene that you were seeing, this beautiful scene, was disappearing behind you. And I thought, was this scene created specially for you?
Well, and it was in some respects. And so what she explained to me was that I wasn't actually in the final, if you will, final heaven or the final destination. I was in sort of a holding room or a waiting room.
Okay.
Or waiting state or something. Wasn't really a place. It was really more of a state. So I was in this holding pattern, if you will. And what I noticed is that it seemed to be that I wasn't really seeing things behind me. You know, if I turn around, it was sort of like a gray fog, but there were things up in front of me. And what she explained is that this place was in part created, or at least the scenes that I saw for me were in part created for me. They were a combination of me and the divine basically working together to create a scene that would be comfortable for me. Because she didn't want me to be scared, and the divine presence didn't want me to be terrified. And so the thought for them, I guess, was that they would create a holding area for me that kind of resonated with me, that I could feel welcome and safe, while at the same time listening to what they were trying to tell me with an open mind. Because when you're afraid, you're shut down, really.
Right. So now this is something that not all NDEers have acknowledged or recognized, because mostly people think they've seen the real heaven, and they don't think that it was created. The vision that they saw was not created especially for them. So this is a very interesting point I wanted to have you describe. Okay, so then you guys are lying in the field, and she's telling you the truths about life and what you're going to have to do when you go back.
Right. Yeah, and that was the hard part for me. Was she said at the very very tail end of this experience that now it's time for you to go back, and you know, in human terms, I would say I blew a gasket. I just really, I threw a temper tantrum, and I didn't want to come back here. And she explained that what she had been teaching me really wasn't for the next step of going on into the full-blown heaven. It was really to come back here. And it was these things that I was being taught, or the things that I was being taught, were given to me to improve my life. And then she said, and by the way, other people might benefit from them as well. And I got very terrified at that point. She said, you might want to share these things with other people. And I thought, nobody's going to believe this. At least of all me.
Did you hear things from your guide that you weren't supposed to talk about?
No, she didn't actually tell me any. Basically whatever she told me I could talk about.
Okay.
If there was any secret knowledge, I don't know.
What sorts of things did you think were most important that she taught?
Well, for me, it would change over time, I think. But initially, for me, it was that love is everywhere, not only in heaven but also here on earth, and that we're here on earth not only to learn and not only to have fun and enjoy this place, but also to love each other. And since then I've read the New Testament, and it's all through the New Testament. But it's really love each other no matter what, even if you don't like the other person. Extend compassion and kindness. Extend camaraderie or brotherly love to people, even if you don't necessarily agree with that person. And that was a hard one for me at first. And I, sometimes still struggle with that.
Oh, I think we all do. You wrote, you write in your book, in heaven I was allowed the gift of seeing into the heart of everyone and everything.
Right.
What was that like?
Oh, I still have that. It's a hard one to deal with here on earth, but I could see underneath of all the stuff around me, I could see the scintillating energy of love and God's presence through everything. And it's very, very difficult to describe it, but it's I think I would need somebody from, ILM or George Lucas's studios to be able to put it to visions. But it was the scintillating energy that I knew was pure love and light and presence through everything. And when I looked at people, I could see it there as well. I could see below the surface of the person, your outer surface. I could see that soul of light, if you will. And I still see that today, which is, it can sometimes still take me by surprise because it's, as a scientist, at least for me, I was trained that, all that spiritual stuff doesn't exist. And now I see it, and it's startling still. But I still see that inside of each person is this beautiful, loving soul that's sometimes suffering a little bit underneath the weight of being a human. And that's the harder part. But it's there. It's a beautiful gift. I'm very appreciative of the gift, even though I'm still struggling a little bit with how to employ that in my life.
Did you see any inkling when you saw into everyone's heart, any kind of suggestion that we live several lives, that reincarnation is part of our existence?
I did, actually. I do get that message, and I did get that message that if we choose it, it's not mandatory, but if we choose it, we can come back. And the one thing I will say is that it became very apparent to me that it truly doesn't matter for each life that you're in right now. I think I've seen, even amongst people that I know, it can be a huge distraction to get all caught up in all those past lives. Some of them may be relevant to today, and some may not be. But the gift in all of it is that while there is the possibility to come back if you want, the gift of your life is the one that we're in right now. Each one of us has this individual, unique incarnation that we're in right now that you'll never get back again, ever. So even if you do reincarnate, you will never be this person again. You'll be somebody else with a different body and, different likes and dislikes. So I'll never be this Nancy again.
What was it like coming back into your body, leaving heaven and coming back?
Ooh, that was hard. I came back to a broken body, and that was one of the things I was really terrified of when they sent me back. I had like over 24 broken bones, and most of them in my back and neck, and so to go from feeling no weight at all. I mean, in heaven I felt light and free and able to do whatever I wanted, and then when I came back, I was in this broken, pain-ridden body that struggled really even to move to get up out of bed and to move. And I struggled, I was in a body cast and a neck brace, and that was hard. And then that was just the physical aspect was hard, but then the trauma almost of being ripped away from that very visceral connection to heaven's presence or to divine love was really hard. It's a lot harder to see and sense that here on Earth because of the physical nature of our existence. So for a while I thought it was gone, but then I realized it was just a little bit hidden under the surface. And then it took about 3 months for that to kind of kick back in. And once that did, I felt a lot better.
Who was the first person you told about your NDE?
Actually, it was a chaplain in the hospital.
Uh-huh.
I was, yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is when I was admitted to the hospital, I told the ER staff, I do not want a chaplain in my room. I'm an atheist. I don't want any of that stuff. of course, she just appeared that the next day after surgery, and I could not bring it up. I had to ask somebody, am I crazy? Or is this real? And she was the best person for me to ask, because she explained how real it was, and that she'd heard this kind of thing before, and that I wasn't crazy, and that it was a real experience of God, or of the divine, or, spirit. And then I slowly told members of my family, and then later my friends, but it took a while. There was still a little bit of fear about what people would say. And yeah.
What was the reaction generally?
Overall, I would say overall very positive amongst my family and friends. There were a few family members that didn't react positively, but for the most part, it was very positive. More positive amongst my friends than I expected, which was wonderful. I'm very appreciative of their support. I was really afraid that people I'd known for years would distance themselves from me, but that wasn't the case. And an interesting thing happened in that one of my friends who I've known for, 12 years or so, admitted that he had an NDE when he was a kid, or actually a young man, and hadn't really told anybody until I talked to him about mine. So it was nice having someone else that could get it within my circle of friends.
I find that's true in the hospital as a chaplain. If I tell someone an NDE story, I get a story back, either of a mystical experience, an out-of-body experience, or an NDE that either they've had, or a family member, or something that they heard that fascinated them. So it's amazing how stories evoke stories.
I think they're more common than people would want to admit,
They are. There's been an estimate of 774 NDEs a day in this country alone.
Wow.
Which is pretty amazing. You came out of this and almost immediately were able to write a book about it. I mean, this is something that happened in January of 2014, and by the next year, you've got a book out and you're speaking at IONS conferences. This is so much faster than most people. Most people, it takes them years, sometimes decades, before they can begin to acknowledge all that's happened. And I was wondering, is this just you, something about you, or does it say something about the society generally that NDEs are so much more accepted today?
I think in part it's because they're very accepted, or at least a lot more so than in previous times. And I also have to admit that I've been a writer for a very long time. I've been a science and technical writer for 20 years. So the first thing I did really when I woke up and my chaplain said, "You're not crazy," is I started to write it down. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote
Great.
for months.
Yeah.
Before I read anything else, I wrote about what I'd experienced. And so,
which is just what Eben Alexander did too.
Well, it helped me. It really helped me wrap my brain around it. That's really one of the ways that I think and process things, is by writing it physically with my hand. And I just know that about myself. Whenever I have a problem, I always write about it, and then I figure it out. So it seemed natural for me to write about it. And then I put those writings into a blog, and then the blog became a book pretty quickly. And I knew it was just the first step. It wasn't the be-all, end-all for me. It was really, as my chaplain said, you're just starting out on the path. And I said, well, it's good, that I can help other people who are also starting out on the path. And that's kind of how I approached it, was, come along with me on this journey. I don't know where it's leading me, but we'll see together what's going to happen.
I did have one question I wanted to ask you on a more, earthly way of thinking. You quote Chief Seattle that all things are bound together. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. And I know back in the 80s you were on an archaeological dig near Amman, Jordan. So you know something about the people of that region. So
Right.
Given what you've learned from your NDE, what are your thoughts on how we should handle this current terrible migration situation crisis that's going on in the Middle East?
Oh, it just rips my heart out. I don't really have any great insights that I think can help the situation right now. I think the only thing for us all to keep in mind is love and compassion, and it's really hard. When I was in the Middle East in Jordan back in the late 80s and early 90s, I spoke with many Palestinian refugees from, who had been ousted from Palestine in the late 40s. And even then, so 40-odd years later, it was still a family trauma that they were dealing with. So what we need to, really understand as an entire world is that, first of all, we need to extend love and compassion to everyone on all sides of this. Even if we don't necessarily like what's going on, I think the only way we can help out right now is to keep in mind being compassionate during this whole process, however it ends up being for everyone involved. As far as, I've thought a lot about the entire situation in certain parts of the world, not only the Middle East, but in other areas as well. Because my heart is still there in some respects. The longstanding violence of that area really bothers me. But the only thing that I can do right now is pray, and send love and compassion and send my heart to all those people over there, hoping for a peaceful situation. And that's really all I can say.
Yeah. Do you think that that might be one reason for reincarnation, that when we have a life as blessed, as comfortable as one in America, that our next lifetime we might experience something as rough as what's going on in Syria right now?
It's a very thought-provoking idea, and one I would agree with. One of the things that I was blessed with as a youth really was going to the Middle East and seeing how harsh life can be for a large part of the world, quite frankly. And to be able to sit there in a Bedouin tent and empathize with people who I'd only read about in books and understand that they didn't have any clean water most days, or, the women didn't have access to education, and to sit in a Palestinian refugee camp and understand that they've, lost their homes that they've lived in for 300 years and are now living at the behest of some foreign government. Most of us here in the U.S. have it pretty posh.
Yeah.
And even if we're poor here in the U.S., it's still a very wealthy life as compared to much of the rest of the world. And I think if we don't get it in this life, we certainly owe it to ourselves and the rest of the world to come back in another life and get it.
Yes. Well, Nancy, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I want you to tell our listeners about your blog, how they can get in touch with that, and also where they can find your book.
Well, everything is available. So the link to my blog is available via my website, awakeningsfromthelight.com. And that's just all spelled out, awakeningsfromthelight.com. Or you can go to the blog directly at thespiritway.blogspot.com. And the book is available through that website as well as on Amazon.com, and you can also request it from your local bookstore as well. So that's
very good.
Several ways.
Well, thank you, Nancy. My thanks to Nancy Rynes for sharing her story. And if you would like to listen to this show again or any other of our previous programs, please visit our website at nderadio.org. And for more information about IANDS, please check that website at iands.org. This is Lee Witting saying thanks for listening.